what are the most common mistakes students make during their visa interview?
Uh, I think, the most common mistake is not realizing that you actually have to be prepared for the interview. I think people think that because they've been accepted into a school that they've kind of, done the hard work of, qualifying for admission, and that as long as they go in with genuine intentions, that they're going to be assured their student visa. But unfortunately, that is too often not the case. I mean, there are requirements that the consular officer is looking for above and beyond the fact that you've been admitted into school. And so, you really do have to know what the officer is looking for and be prepared for that. Refusal rates, unfortunately, around the world are quite high. They're higher in some countries than in others. And every day we hear people say, I was shocked to have been refused.
Yes. uh, Here, I see that we have several questions from people. Thank you so much for those. We will be answering them at the end of the session. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the comments and we'll make sure to get to you at the end of the session. Thank you so much for everybody here. Um, can you share some general tips on how to prepare effectively for a visa interview?
I think the best tip is to know what the requirements are, right? The requirements for a student visa are that you are a credible student, that you have the necessary funding to attend school and to live in the US while you're attending school, and that you'll be returning to your home country after your program finishes. Those are the three major requirements that the officer is looking for, no matter what they ask you. And all of your questions should be addressing one of the, or all of your answers, excuse me, should be addressing one of those three requirements.
Hmm, interesting. Can you walk us through a typical visa interview process for international students and what are some of the key things officers are looking for during these interviews?
Yeah, I mean, a typical visa interview, experience will be coming to the embassy, going through a lot of security, giving up all of your electronics at the door, going into a waiting room, waiting with a lot of other people for a lot longer past your visa appointment than you might expect. You don't have any privacy in your interview. It's usually walking up to a row of windows. You'll be able to hear other people's interviews. Other people will likely be able to hear yours depending on, if you're at a very busy post, a very, big embassy or consulate, or at a small one, your experience, of course, might vary, but you give your fingerprints, you hand over your passport, and then the visa interview begins. The visa interview is super short, on average, 3 to 5 questions. I think this surprises a lot of people. We often hear, I didn't get the chance to say anything. I didn't, the officer didn't even ask me anything. But those 2 or 3 questions, that's your opportunity to show the officer that you meet those three requirements: credible student, funding, returning to home country.
How important is it to understand the visa regulations and policies before the interview?
I mean, yeah, I mean, you want to know what the officer is looking for so you know what to say. And by that, I don't mean like make things up. You should always go in and tell the truth. But the truth that you tell should be relevant to the visa officer. If you go in and tell the officer a bunch of stuff that isn't relevant to these requirements, the visa officer is going to cut you off and not hear what you're saying. So not only do you want to know the requirements, but you have to think about how is the officer going to apply those requirements? How do you determine if somebody is a credible student? How do you know if the funding is sufficient? How do you know if that person is going to come back after they finish their program, at the end of their stay? So this is what we at Argo do. We tell, our clients like, hey, this is how an officer interprets these requirements. This is what they're looking for. These are the things, about you and your situation that you're going to want to volunteer at the first opportunity in your interview.
Very interesting, yes. Are there any specific documents that students often overlook or don't prepare well enough for?
I mean, you want to bring your I-20, of course. You want to bring proof that you have the funds to cover expenses at school, any other documents that might support that you're a credible student. So, for example, transcripts from your previous university. If you have a job offer waiting for you when you finish school, that's evidence that could be useful to bring. But we always tell all of our clients to be prepared to answer questions as if the officer isn't going to look at any documents, because there's no guarantee that the officer is going to want to see your documents. They're trying to make decisions as quickly as possible. The reason why the interview is an in-person interview is because, the US government has decided at some point that that information coming from the person directly is more believable, more valuable than what is written on paper. And so oftentimes officers will say that they don't want to see your documents.
Okay, interesting. Yes. Now we'd like to give a bit of more behavioral tips, like how should students handle nervousness and anxiety during the interview?
Yeah, we get this question a lot. I think the most helpful thing I can tell you about nervousness is everybody is nervous. The consular officer knows that you're nervous. They know that, attending this school in the US can be a life-changing event. They expect you to be a little nervous. So I always say, don't be nervous about being nervous. Now, if you're nervous to the point that, you're not able to articulate your qualifications, that's a different story. And that's something that can be overcome with some tailored coaching and practicing. And that is something that we do via our mock interviews. So if you come to Argo Visa for a consultation, we do a strategy
Oh,
session, and then depending on, the package you book, we like to do mock interviews with students as well. And the good thing about the mock interview is it gives people a sense of, what's the tone and pace of the interview going to be like, in addition to what are the questions. And then most valuably, it gives students the opportunity to practice their answers and to get feedback from a former visa officer about, oh, hey, these answers are convincing, or these answers are less convincing. And, specific tips on how they can make sure that their answers are relevant to the requirements of the visa category and going to be persuasive.
great. Yes. Having a mock interview is always a phenomenal idea. Like they say, practice
That's
makes perfect.
right.
Can you please share with us some real life examples of students and how you've helped them and prepare, and how you helped them, how their preparation made a difference?
Yeah, just the other day, I had a client who'd been refused his student visa already. And what had happened at his student visa interview was he took all the advice that he read online about, saying as little as possible, and not sharing with the consular officer, only asking the question that was asked. He didn't really have a good understanding of what the requirements were and what was important to the consular officer, so he was refused. But after speaking with him, I realized that, had really strong ties to not his home country necessarily, but to a Western country. He had a right to live and work in a major Western economy, that he had set up his own business recently that was very lucrative and worth coming home for. He struggled too with nervousness. And so, we practiced and practiced and practiced. And I just got the good news yesterday that he was approved his visa the second
Wow,
time around. Yeah.
great, great news. Thing. What are some of the red flags that consular officers should watch out for?
I think the biggest red flags are if the funding, so I think that, the funding component is a funny one, because if an officer is really convinced that you're a credible student and they're really convinced that you're going to return to your home country at the end of your studies, they have faith that you'll make the funding work, right? So to that extent, funding is not super, it's not the most important of the three requirements, I would say. But on the other hand, if you've had to sell everything that you've ever owned, if your parents had to sell, property and homes and cars in order for you to get this education in the US, I would say that's a red flag, because it wouldn't make a lot of financial sense to do that unless your plan was in fact to perhaps stay and live in the US permanently, in which case it might make sense to sell everything,
Correct.
for those bigger economic opportunities. So whenever you talk about your funding, don't talk about it in terms of like, oh, school costs $50,000 and I have $50,000 and won, because we sold everything. But talk about it in terms of an investment and why it's an investment worth making for somebody who is going to be returning to their home country.
Okay. And how can students avoid giving this impression that they might overstay their visa or not return to their home country?
Uh, That's such a good question, Raymond, because I think this is actually the hardest requirement for many students to meet. That is that they are going to come home to their home country after their studies, especially when it comes to younger students who are just finishing, A levels or high school, and they're going to a 4-year program. They may not have a really clear and concrete vision of what they're going to do after school, and that's normal for a young person. But even if the consular officer doesn't ask you what your plans are post school, you should be referring to your future plans in just about every answer you give. So, why is it worth, we were just talking about funding. That's a good example. Why is it worth, all of this money for you to go to the U.S.? Well, it's because of the economic opportunities the economic opportunities you're expecting to have when you return to your home country. Why do you want to study in the U.S.? Because of what you want to do in your home country post graduation. So even though the officer is not directly asking you, what are you going to do after school, you should always be referring to those future plans.
Great tips. Thank you for everyone sending their questions. We have quite a few of these. We have a lot of engagement. And thank you everyone for sending your questions. We'll be answering these at the end of the session. So please stay tuned. We will get to your questions. Thank you so much. Um, Now, moving forward to like post interview, what should students do if they are denied a visa? Are there any steps they could take to improve their chances on a second attempt?
Well, first, let me say what you shouldn't do is keep applying and keep doing the same thing because the more refusals you have, the harder it is to be approved. Put yourself in the consular officer's shoes for just a moment. If 2 or 3 of their colleagues have made the determination that you're not qualified for the visa, they're not going to make a different determination based on that same information. So, step number one is don't just go back and do the same thing, make the same mistakes over and over again. You're just making it harder and harder for yourself. Second tip is try to identify why you were refused. I mean, this is how a consultation with Argo Visa can be really helpful because if you remember things about your visa interview, what was asked, what did you say, we can make a pretty good educated guess as to why you were refused. Then we're going to help you make sure you don't make that same mistake again, and then doing those mock interviews to practice the strategy that we developed to help you overcome whatever the stumbling block was that first time around.
Okay. And how can students follow up or seek feedback after their interview?
Yeah, unfortunately, the visa officer themselves, the one that interviews you and refuses you, is not going to tell you the exact reason why you were refused. They'll give you a letter that says, basically that you're refused under Section 214B, either for not having enough ties to their home country or because they just don't believe you're a credible student. But that doesn't really tell you very much. If you know in your heart of hearts you're a credible student that intends to return home, that's not really helpful in terms of knowing what the exact reason was and what you should be doing differently in your next visa interview.
Okay. Do you have any specific advice for students with complicated cases, such as those who have been denied a visa before or have gaps in their academic record?
Yeah, I mean, having a gap in your academic record isn't necessarily a bad thing. You just have to be prepared to explain like why this education makes sense at this point in your life. Whether you're going through a career transition or you're looking for that next promotion, maybe you feel like you've hit kind of a ceiling, with the education you have up to that point, and you're looking to make it to that next level. In terms of previous refusals, like we discussed, I think the key is figuring out why you were refused and not making the same mistakes again. When you go into your visa interview, it kind of depends whether or not you address it head on, without being asked. That would really, I think, depend on the circumstances.
Okay. Now we're opening up the floor up to the questions from our audience. We've been waiting for. Let me check if what questions we have here. Let's go from top to bottom. We have. Does anyone with a travel ban in Canada due to misinterpretation have a chance of getting an F1 visa in the USA?
Uh, I think what the questioner means is if they have been found 6C for misrepresentation, um, you do have a lifelong ban if you are found 6C for misrepresentation. That's including for the student visa, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't get a waiver, and it also doesn't mean that you couldn't get that finding overturned, depending on the circumstances around the alleged misrepresentation. So, which avenue you take would really depend on the circumstances upon which you were found to have misrepresented yourself. But all hope is not lost if you do have a 6C on your record. You just need some additional help. So, at Argo Visa, we don't give legal advice. We only give interview preparation help, but we can help you have a strategy for going into your interview if the desire, for example, is to request a waiver.
Okay, thanks. Here we have another one from Unita. After rejection, how much gap is needed for your next attempt?
It really depends on why you were rejected. If you were rejected because you just didn't do a very good job representing yourself and demonstrating how you meet the qualifications, but you are in fact qualified, then there's no point in waiting. You should, have a strategy and reapply once you have that strategy. If, however, you're being refused because you in fact don't quite meet the qualifications, your ties really aren't that strong, then it makes sense to wait until your roots in your home country are run a little deeper. So, for example, somebody who's applying for a tourist visa, who's young and single, doesn't have a high-paying job, doesn't have a lot of travel history. In that situation, it might make sense for that individual to wait until they're married, they have a good paying job, they own a home, they have a lot of reasons to return to their home country to reapply again at that point. Now, with students, of course, it's harder. Most students are younger and single, don't have a lot of ties. And that's when it becomes really important to have this vision of what you want to do after school in your home country and be able to convey that to the consular officer in a way that convinces the consular officer that you really intend to do that.
Great insight. Here we have another one from Kasol. She says, if me and my sister are both applying for F1 visa, will it create any problems in the interview?
That depends. It depends on if, the officer realizes, like, if you're applying together in the same appointment, then yeah, you have to be doubly convincing that you're both coming back. If one sibling is already in the US on a student visa, then the second sibling will need to explain, why it is that their ties to their home country are stronger than their ties to the US, even if they have a sibling in the US. So, I mean, the short answer is yes, it does complicate things, but it doesn't mean that you won't qualify for your visa.
Okay. Here we have one from Faisalmir. Says, regarding my wife, she is 34 years old. She has an 11-year gap. Still, can she apply for a master's?
Yeah, I mean, many professionals do a master's later in their career. You just have to do a little more legwork in explaining, why it is that you want the master's now, why perhaps you didn't feel the need for a master's before, but you do now, and how that's going to benefit you either in your current career that you've been, working in your home country, or if you're transitioning to a new career, why that transition makes sense at this point in time, and most importantly, why that transition is going to happen in your home country. I should clarify, I keep saying home country, but actually it's any country other than the United States. So, for example, if you are from Ghana and you have been working, at a great job in Dubai and your ties are to the UAE, that's okay. Like, just as long as you're demonstrating that after your studies, you're going to go back to the UAE, that absolutely works too. Home country is just shorthand for any country besides the US.
Okay, yes, that's a great thing to point out. We have a question from Faiza. She says, my younger sister went for an interview and she has been placed on AP. Her I-20 and passports were the only documents that VO took. What does this mean?
Honestly, it could mean any number of things. AP is short for administrative processing, and basically what it means is the officer's not ready to make a decision in the case yet. They're not saying, I mean, technically it is a refusal because they're saying you refused until we are able to ascertain more information that would justify an approval. But an easier way to think of it is that it's a temporary refusal. When that refusal turns into an approval will really depend on what information the officer is lacking. And it could be anything from, oh, we just want to see this additional document and we've asked you for it. And once we have it, we can approve you, to security reasons that could take a much longer time for the officer to get verified.
Okay. What are my chances of getting a visa if my brother is already on an F1 visa and now utilizing his CPT?
You know, of course, it's easier for you to get an F1 visa after your brother has returned to his home country, because then you're able to demonstrate that as a family you use visas properly, and that there isn't a pattern of misusing visas. So, in other words, it could be a benefit to you, you know, if your brother demonstrates, oh yeah, we're the kind of people that are credible and going to return per the requirements of the visa. If, however, you want to apply for your visa before your brother comes home, then yeah, you're going to have to be really clear about the fact that your brother is coming home and the reasons why he's coming home, and also too the reasons why you're coming home. So it's kind of double duty there that should be done in your visa interview.
Okay. Here we have a few questions that have been asked before. Sorry if we are going through those. She says here, after rejection, can we apply again if we have a valid reason, or do we need a gap to attempt next interview?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, you can apply again, but remember, don't just go in and make the same mistakes that you made last time. You know why you were refused before you go in. Otherwise, you're just wasting your money, and worse, you're making it harder and harder on yourself to get approved that visa. You know, a gap, depending on how long we're talking about, is unlikely to make a significant difference unless it's a significant gap and a lot has changed in that time. Again, Argo Visa, that's what we're here for, is to help, you know, you make those kinds of decisions about whether or not now is a good time to reapply, depending on why you refused before.
Okay. Here's an interesting one. My sister is a U.S. citizen and she applied for a green card for my parents. Does this negatively impact or affect my F1 visa?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's not that you can't qualify for a student visa if you have relatives in the US, but when you have a sibling and your parents in the US, those are really, really strong ties now that you have to the US. So, what the officer is going to be weighing are your personal ties to the US, which are quite strong because of family, and your economic reasons for staying in the US, which can be quite compelling, versus what you're saying to the officer is your plan, and that is to return to your home country. So you're going to have to be really clear as to, you know, why you're different from your family members, in the sense that you do want to return after your studies. If the plan is to go and study in the US and then stay, you don't meet the qualifications for the visa. And you know, we may not agree with that policy or like it. I mean, certainly, you know, I would be one of the first to argue that we should encourage people who've studied higher education in the US to stay and work on the local US economy. But unfortunately, that's not what this category of visa is intended for at this time.
That is unfortunate. Here we have a question from Dr. Surya. My question is, does my B1 visa rejection impact my F1 visa?
It depends on why that B1 visa was refused, but there's a good chance that it would because most often when people are refused a B1, it's for lack of strong ties to their home country, and that same requirement applies to students. So if your ties aren't strong enough for a B1, B2 visa, there's a good chance that your ties aren't strong enough for the student visa either. But it doesn't mean that, oh, if you've been refused a B1, B2, you can't be approved an F1. It's just that you really need to analyze what was the reason for that refusal and how do you overcome those doubts in your student visa interview.
Okay. Here we have another one. She states, I've applied for my V1, V2, and my travel date on DS-160 is June 17th, but the available interview slot is on September 30th. How do I go about this?
Well, it depends on what your reason for travel is. B1, B2, is both for tourism and business. So, for example, if you were traveling for business and the conference was June 17th, I mean, you have to have a new reason for wanting that B1, B2 if you're applying in September. If you're going for vacation and you just decide, well, since we couldn't get the visa in time for the June 17th date, that we're going to travel over Christmas vacation instead and keep that September visa interview, that's certainly an understandable explanation that the consular officer can accept in terms of the timing of the visa interview.
Okay. Kaifu Ka states, I got rejected twice for F1 before. Uh, that I did twice, J1 in States. What would be the chances for a third time for a visa?
So this person's been on a J1 twice and then was refused two F1s.
Yes, she got rejected twice for F1 before, and she did twice a J1 in the States. What would
Yeah.
be the chances for a third time?
Yeah, I mean that's really hard to say because that sounds like a complicated situation that I would need to know a lot more information about to make a prediction. Because we don't know how this individual used their J1 visas. We don't know why they were refused the F1 visas. So it's hard to say whether or not they'd be approved on a third attempt. I mean, the fact that you were refused two times means that there is something that's not quite right, either in what you're saying to the officer or in your actual circumstances. So definitely that one would need a more in-depth look before we could say one way or another if it's worth reapplying.
Okay. Here we still have quite a few questions. If you have any questions, please send us a message or please contact Argo Visa. We would like to give a few final thoughts on this interview. What is one piece of advice you will give to every student preparing for the visa interview?
Know what the requirements are and make sure you're ready to meet those requirements in your answers and don't wait to be directly asked. The implicit in any question you get from the consular officer is, how do you meet the requirements for the student visa?
Okay. And how can students reach out to Argo Visa for more personalized assistance?
Yeah, so you can come to our website, argovisa.com, where you can learn about the team of former visa officers that we have, the packages and services that we offer. You can also write to us at hello@argovisa.com if you have any questions.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you so much, Lisa, for sharing these invaluable insights and tips. I'm sure our interviewers have learned a lot today. For those of you who want to dive deeper into personalized guidance with Argo Visa, don't hesitate to reach out for expert help tailored for your specific needs. Remember, everyone, mastering your visa interview is a crucial step towards achieving your dream of studying in the USA. With the right preparation and support, you can navigate the process successfully. Thank you all for joining us today, and best of luck with your visa interviews. Stay tuned for more helpful sessions for studying in the USA. Until next time, take care. Have a wonderful day, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Raymond.
Bye
Take
bye.
care. Bye.